A startup board director would call this a founder's fatal mistake, confusing control with invincibility. Julian thinks he can restructure his company, his image, and even his family without consequence, because everyone around him keeps rewarding the performance. But once Elara finds the continuity plan, the illusion breaks. The pregnant wife, written off as sentimental decoration, becomes the only person in the room capable of understanding the system well enough to bring the whole facade down.
Olivia stood amidst the polished concrete and soaring glass of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her 7-month pregnancy. A silent vow was forming for the new life within her. On the other side of the benefit, the titans of Silicon Valley were toasting her husband, Leo Vance, but the man they celebrated was a masterfully crafted illusion. Leo, the venture capitalist whose Midas touch turned startups into unicorns, was holding court with a group of city supervisors. Tucked close to his side was Kara Reed, his hungry and brilliant junior partner. A woman whose ambition was as sleek and disruptive as the tech she championed. They didn't look like a mentor and his protege. They looked like the next power couple on the cover of a business magazine. Just moments before, Leo had dismissed her anxiety about Kara's constant presence. "You're overthinking it, Liv," he'd murmured. "I need you to grab the quarterly report for the Atherton Fund off our family cloud for the mayor's aid." But in the cloud, tucked away in a folder ominously labeled Legacy, she found something else. It was a complete prospectus for a stunning private vineyard estate in Napa. This wasn't for a client. It was an off-the-books holding company designed to shield immense personal wealth, and in the margins of the financial projections, a handwritten note in Leo's familiar scrawl, "K, for the next chapter, the transition is underway." The ambient electronic music of the gala dissolved into a low hum. Her marriage, her home, her baby, they were all just legacy assets being liquidated in a hostile takeover of her life. In 2 days alone in their minimalist penthouse overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, she would uncover the full scope of his betrayal. A leveraged buyout so perfectly structured it was designed to leave her with nothing. This was so much more than an affair. It was a corporate restructuring of her entire world. The Napa prospectus was just the executive summary. After leaving the gala early, feigning a sudden wave of fatigue, she navigated to his encrypted personal server from her home office. There were no incriminating text messages, but there was a hidden partition loaded with shadow financial ledgers. Trips to the Cayman Islands and Singapore, documented as international fundraising, were actually for setting up untraceable trust funds for Leo and Kara. A $250,000 wire to a boutique tech firm was coded as a stealth mode seed investment, but Olivia recognized it as the drone company Kara had been obsessed with for months. This wasn't a cheap dalliance, it was a succession plan. Kara wasn't just his mistress. She was his designated successor, and Olivia, with her unborn son, was the last liability on the balance sheet. But this isn't the story of a broken woman. It's the story of what happened when the man who saw his wife as a charming, well-connected hostess realized he had fundamentally miscalculated his risk. It's the story of how she weaponized her deep understanding of his portfolio companies, their founders' egos, their investors' fears, their market vulnerabilities, to dismantle a venture capital dynasty from the inside out. It's about how a visionary's grand strategy to launch his new life became the very prospectus for his own spectacular ruin. For 3 days, a dense, chilling fog rolled in from the Pacific, blanketing the city in a gray silence, as if San Francisco itself could feel the storm brewing high in the glass towers. The tech founders in their $1,000 hoodies, the politicians who courted Leo's investments, the industry bloggers who chronicled their every move, they all bought into the flawless branding. Leo Vance, the ruthless venture capital visionary, and his elegant wife Olivia, the philanthropic heart of their partnership. They never questioned why Leo's private cell buzzed with Kara's name at all hours, or how he'd begun to critique Olivia's charity work with the detached analysis of a growth hacker. They didn't notice Kara, who had joined the firm 2 years ago and ruthlessly engineered a place for herself at the center of their universe. Olivia had even tried to mentor her. Kara was fiercely intelligent, dressed in sharp, minimalist lines, and always delivered compliments that now felt like cold-blooded market assessments. Leo is just playing a different game than everyone else, she'd say. It must be hard for you, focused on the less scalable projects. Alone in the now silent penthouse, Olivia whispered to her baby, a quiet oath. I am so sorry I ignored my gut. I'm sorry I let him convince me it was just pregnancy hormones. The digital prospectus on the tablet in front of her felt impossibly heavy, weighted not by kilobytes, but by years of meticulously rendered lies. She replayed every time Leo had explained away her intuition. His late nights at the office with Kara were always about hammering out the term sheet for the AI deal. Their constant travel together was essential to closing the new European fund. The creeping feeling that she was being diluted out of her own life was just her inability to handle the pressure of his world. He had gaslighted her into believing her own instincts were a flawed business model. She watched as Kara's aggressive, move fast and break things ethos became the celebrated new culture of the firm. She watched them build a world of inside jokes and shared victories that became an impenetrable fortress, leaving Olivia on the outside. She was the inconvenient variable in their perfect projection, a rounding error that needed to be written off. Not one person intervened. In their glittering circle, you never questioned the man who funded the future. So Olivia straightened her spine, the deep ache in her back a physical reminder of the life she was now fighting for. She walked past the framed articles celebrating his genius, past the shelves of deal trophies, past every monument to the empire he had built, an empire he was now vesting in another woman. She didn't cause a scene. She didn't break down. She walked out of the museum and into the crisp San Francisco night, no longer a heartbroken wife, but a rival VC planning a complete and devastating liquidation. She had the driver take her not to their penthouse, but to her own quiet headquarters, the offices of the Arts Foundation she ran in a historic building in the Presidio. The scent of old books and canvas was a comfort, a tangible reality far from the cold, abstract world of finance. There, in the warm glow of a desk lamp, she began to strategize. Not with messy emotion, but with the cool, calculated precision of an analyst preparing for a hostile takeover. She used the password she'd seen in his notes, the one he called Seed Round, and gained access to his entire private cloud. The discovery was more than a shock, it was a forensic audit of her own erasure. The cruelty was in the details. A drafted press release announcing their amicable separation, citing her desire to step back and focus on her growing family. A file from a private investigator detailing her every move for the last 6 months. He wasn't just leaving her, he was building a legal and public relations firewall around himself, one carefully documented file at a time. You should never create a pitch deck for your own crime, Leo, she whispered into the silent, history-filled office. Her voice was calm, like a historian stating an irrefutable fact. Most men just have an affair. You created a due diligence folder. Most people hadn't been looking, but Olivia had. She turned to a large whiteboard and began to map out her counter strategy. The heavy modern ring on her finger, the one Leo had a startup jeweler design, back when his fund was just an idea sketched out in their tiny apartment, now felt like a cold, steel manacle. The blood pounding in her ears was the only sound in the office. 200 of the Bay Area's most influential people had just celebrated her husband's brilliance, and not one of them noticed the hostile buyout happening right beside him, not a single questioning look, not one whispered word of concern, nothing. Kara stood next to him, confident and triumphant, her hand metaphorically on the button. Olivia remembered Kara's argument at a recent board meeting she'd attended. Our first priority has to be sunsetting any legacy assets that are a drag on the portfolio. Olivia finally understood that she was the legacy asset being sunsetted. She held her belly, her promise to her son now solidifying into a plan stripped of all tears or rage. He wanted a partner to build an empire, she thought. He just picked the wrong woman to liquidate. No one defended her because no one saw a problem. They saw a radiant, pregnant wife supporting her visionary husband. Every single one of them had invested in the beautiful lie. Olivia didn't know it yet, But her silent declaration of war was already in motion, triggered by the very evidence they had so carelessly compiled. And that evidence, like a critical vulnerability in their code, was about to cause a total system crash. For 2 years, their life was a shared prospectus. He was the man she knew before the billion-dollar hedge fund and the profiles in financial journals, the one who'd eat street cart gyros with her on the floor of their cramped North End apartment, coding trading algorithms on a battered laptop. That version of him brought her coffee every morning and would listen for hours as she detailed the intricate politics of 17th century maritime trade for her research. He was present. He struggled to articulate his own market anxieties, but he would grip her hand and just keep coding. Then wealth arrived. It flooded their lives like a tsunami of investor capital and fawning interviews. And with that wealth came Katrina. She was 42, a shark he'd lured away from a rival London firm, renowned for her aggressive emerging market strategy and an even more aggressive personality. She understood Marcus's inside jokes about arbitrage. She sharpened his presentations to investors. She landed the sovereign wealth fund that had always been a pipe dream. He hired her 6 months after his fund, Apex Capital, had its first profitable quarter. Eleanor had been his most vocal supporter in that decision. She agreed he needed the absolute best team. She smiled for the photographers because he wanted her to, and because his triumph felt like their shared victory. Even as a faint tremor of warning vibrated deep inside her, a feeling like a hairline crack in a vault door. The changes were so incremental, Eleanor failed to see them as a calculated campaign. First, their long Saturday walks along the Charles River disappeared. Marcus said the new fund demanded his undivided attention, and Katrina was the only one who could navigate the complex international regulations. What Eleanor failed to grasp then was that Katrina wasn't just monopolizing his schedule. She was actively rewriting the narrative of his life, editing Eleanor out. Whenever Eleanor voiced feeling disconnected from him, Katrina would later reframe it to Marcus as Eleanor's understandable nesting instinct. Every suggestion Eleanor made for their new Beacon Hill brownstone was funneled through Katrina and presented back to Marcus as charming but not quite on brand for our public profile. Her attempts to reach the man she married were deflected by a barrage of conference calls and late-night strategy sessions. Katrina had systematically exchanged their private intimacy for public validation, and Eleanor felt as though she were being slowly liquidated. Her husband stopped asking about her historical research. Eventually, he stopped truly seeing her at all. She had no idea he was being told she was finding the new social demands overwhelming and was a bit intimidated by Katrina's professional drive. She was completely unaware that her marriage was the subject of a quiet, hostile takeover. Each night, Marcus would ask Eleanor about the baby's room, and her answer was a familiar refrain. "It's almost ready, darling. I just need your opinion on the antique mobile I found. I can't hang it without you." But to his chief strategist, Katrina, Marcus painted a starkly different picture. "She's completely absorbed with the nursery, bless her heart. It gives us the runway we need." He'd call it a kindness, a way to shield her from stress. Then he'd add with a chilling fervor, "The last thing we want is to upset her before the baby arrives." Eleanor had stopped wondering what time his town car would pull up, ceased listening for his key in the door, and abandoned hope of feeling his hand on her belly in the middle of the night. She was becoming a beautiful, silent asset in their polished townhouse overlooking the common, a ghost in the stately rooms that were meant to be their shared future, now filled with nothing but the distant hum of the city. She was 7 months pregnant when she first noticed it. It wasn't a bank statement or a suspicious receipt, it was a scent. Sandalwood, not the earthy kind she kept in a diffuser, but a sharp, ferociously expensive fragrance that clung to the collars of his shirts. She had paused her own academic career, shelving her research fellowship on colonial trade routes. She had swapped her cozy, book-filled university office for the cold marble of a life she didn't recognize. She kept a single photo on her nightstand, from a weekend in Vermont before the money, when he looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered, both of them laughing, huddled under an awning in a sudden storm. She hadn't felt the focus of that man's gaze in years when she first smelled the sandalwood. She asked about it once. "It's Katrina's. he'd said, waving a dismissive hand. Her office is next to mine. The smell is everywhere. The scent became a harbinger, an invisible third person in their home. It was on his suit jackets, in the car, a ghost she couldn't confront. The note that accompanied the flowers simply read, "For Katrina, to celebrate the win, all my love, M." Eleanor had found it in the trash, a discarded card from a massive bouquet that had been delivered to his office. She sat there, the glossy card cold in her hand, the city lights outside blurring into streaks. She didn't cry. A cold, dense certainty was forming in her chest, a pressure that had been building for months. Crying would mean accepting that the woman who believed in partnership and promises was a fool. He wasn't coming back to her, not the man she had built a life with. And now she knew why. The annual Boston Philanthropic Gala was in 2 days. It was less about charity and more about cementing status. Marcus Vance, the wunderkind CEO of Apex Capital, never missed a chance to manage his image. He always said that perception was the only market indicator that mattered. The heavy, cream-colored invitation lay on her dresser, an address for the Museum of Fine Arts, a start time, and one engraved sentence, "Our future is our greatest asset." The main hall of the museum was a crush of bespoke suits and couture gowns, thick with the scent of perfume and the quiet hum of immense wealth. Katrina arrived 20 minutes early, which was her standard practice. Power, to her, was about owning the space first, analyzing the board and forcing everyone else to play on her terms. She wore a severe silver dress that shimmered like a freshly minted coin because she wasn't mourning an end. She was celebrating a successful acquisition. Her date was a junior analyst, bright and utterly forgettable, the perfect camouflage. Katrina was poised for this evening to be her public ascension. Eleanor arrived exactly on time, wearing a simple gown of deep emerald silk that draped over the curve of her pregnancy. She had managed to conceal the swelling around her eyes from the tears that had finally, briefly broken through. The sharp agony in her heart had subsided into a heavy, constant weight. She wore no jewelry except her wedding band. She found their assigned table near the main stage, rested her hands on her stomach, and did not scan the crowd for Marcus. She wasn't looking for anyone. Her gaze fell upon the massive digital display dominating the stage, a cascade of green, upward-trending market data from his fund. It was brilliant and cold, the numbers flickering with a relentless, inhuman energy under the spotlights. She recalled Marcus whispering to her once, years ago, on the steps of the public library. "The fundamentals are everything, Ellie. It's the boring work you do when no one is watching." He used to believe things like that back when he spent weekends volunteering to teach financial literacy to kids in Dorchester. It's the only way to build something that can weather a storm. The room buzzed with power. The chief financial officer of a rival firm gave her a respectful nod from across the room. A pair of trustees murmured to each other as their gaze shifted to her stomach. Katrina let out a crisp, controlled laugh at something her escort said, and then the massive oak doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open and her entire foundation cracked apart. Marcus made his entrance. He was not alone. Katrina, her silver dress catching the light like a flare, was on his arm. Not as his employee, not as a guest. He was holding her hand, their fingers linked together. He moved with the smooth, assured entitlement of a man who traded in reality itself, a man who had never faced a loss. He wore an immaculate tuxedo, but his smile was generic, designed for the financial press. His sharp, predatory eyes swept the room, not for his wife, but for the most powerful investors. The quiet murmur in his wake simply ceased. He adjusted the microphone, his gaze sweeping over the Boston Charity Gala, a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns before it settled on Eleanor. He offered a small, private smile to his 8 months pregnant wife, a perfect portrait of devotion, and then his eyes shifted fractionally to the left. He looked at Katrina Shaw, his top analyst, and the corner of his mouth ticked upward in a way that was intimate, conspiratorial, and utterly devastating. "My deepest thanks for your generosity tonight," Marcus Vance boomed, his voice the confident instrument that commanded trading floors and swayed boards. My firm's chief strategist, Miss Shaw, and I were just discussing our next philanthropic venture. He gestured vaguely toward Katrina. Now let's raise some money. Katrina's smile was a thin, triumphant line. Her eyes met Eleanor's across the glittering ballroom in a silent, brutal checkmate. For months, Marcus had been coming home late, his shirts carrying the scent of sandalwood, a fragrance she had never owned. He'd explained it away as the stress of launching a new international fund. He once said that dynasties are built not by the brilliant, but by the utterly ruthless. Resilience, he'd told her, placing a hand on her swollen stomach, is proven when the market turns. This is merely a stress test before our real legacy is born. He had then poured himself a dram of single malt scotch. He'd always said a company's real value wasn't measured when the market was soaring, but when it was in total freefall. He had been looking right at Chloe then, but she knew he was talking about a different kind of venture. She watched him now, stepping off the keynote stage to meet Simone, and a foundational belief inside her didn't just crack, it atomized. It was the distinct feeling of being a flagship product that had just been declared obsolete. At a ringside table, Simone's hand was on Julian's sleeve. A subtle but unmistakable claim of partnership. Over 200 tech investors and journalists were in that conference hall, all watching the silent, hostile takeover of a marriage. One person stood up. One person pushed her chair back, her untouched glass of sparkling water forgotten, and moved through the labyrinth of tables past the venture capitalists and angel investors who were now whispering with a fresh, predatory excitement. She walked directly to the stage, took the microphone from the moderator's stand, and began the most important pitch of her life. Her voice was steady. "He's right," she said, her eyes scanning the powerful audience, pointedly ignoring her husband. "A company's true value is tested under pressure. And my husband," she paused, letting the statement echo in the suddenly quiet room, "has just experienced a catastrophic failure of his ethical source code." She finally locked eyes with Julian, whose face was a frozen screen of disbelief. "And you," she said, her gaze landing on Simone, "can have the high-risk beta test acquisition, but his legacy will never be yours." Chloe's breathing was calm. Her hand rested protectively over her stomach. She twisted the custom-made titanium smart ring from her finger and dropped it into the glass of water on the podium. "Consider this the final fork of the Thorne-Callaway partnership," she announced, her voice resonating with an authority no one had heard from her before. "Effective immediately, with the entire Bay Area tech scene as our witness." She lifted the glass. The first asset in her new portfolio wasn't a stock or a startup, it was the reclamation of her own worth. "If you are hearing my voice, it is because I have dictated my own terms when it would have been simpler to accept a buyout. Those terms belong to me, and to my child. We are retaining 100% of the equity in our own future." A low, collective murmur swept through the crowd. It wasn't just shock, it was the sound of Silicon Valley's elite watching a dynasty implode in real time. Simone's face turned ashen. Julian's co-founder, David, looked like he was about to lose his catered lunch in a nearby succulent arrangement. Board members were already covertly tapping messages into their phones. Chloe stared at Julian, whose hands were clenched, his face a storm of fury. Her voice lowered to a whisper for his ears only. "I don't get it. You act like I'm invisible." Julian's face contorted into a sneer. "I saw her every single day," he hissed back, his voice laced with venom. "She understands the price of disruption, and she provides the kind of exponential growth you stopped delivering years ago." Simone's voice, sharp with panic, sliced through the tension. "This is completely out of line. This is a private matter. Our comms team will be handling this slander." Chloe ignored her completely. Her gaze was still fixed on Julian. "Your PR department can spin whatever narrative they want, Julian. But you should know I've been quietly diversifying my own holdings. I have backups of everything." The summit devolved into a flurry of hushed, urgent conversations. Chloe walked away, her posture perfect. David made 3 frantic calls before he even reached the exit. Julian and Simone were instantly surrounded by anxious investors. Chloe sat in a driverless car for 20 minutes, one hand on her belly, watching the lights of the Bay Bridge streak by. The car waited patiently. When Chloe finally spoke the address of a boutique hotel in Nob Hill she'd always adored, a place she kept in reserve for emergencies, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in years: control. She didn't sleep. She sat in a velvet armchair, listening to the muted hum of the city, a cup of herbal tea growing cold on the table. She wasn't thinking about share prices. She was reviewing the digital portfolio of a brilliant emerging artist, a talent she had discovered for a future she was finally ready to curate on her own. It was a dizzying web of joint crypto wallets and co-owned tech stocks, a golden cage built to guarantee her dependence. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with calls from blocked numbers and panicked emails from people who had treated her like a decorative accessory for years. She switched it to silent and called Maya. So Maya's voice came through calm and unsurprised. "You've officially executed your exit strategy." "I suppose I have," Chloe replied, the words feeling foreign. "I'm not totally clear on the terms of the divestment yet. It goes like this: you're letting me take you to brunch tomorrow. I'm thinking chilaquiles at Zazie with extra avocado, and we are getting a half-dozen Queen Amman from B Patisserie. Non-negotiable." Chloe almost smiled. Almost. "Maya, I'm terrified." A moment of silence, then Maya's voice softened. "I know, honey, but you are your own most valuable intellectual property. You have me, and you have that little startup in there who is about to be launched by the most sought-after curator in San Francisco. I haven't announced the new project, I know, but you will. When you're ready to go public." Chloe placed a hand on her stomach. The baby kicked, a firm, reassuring thump like a book closing on a successful deal. The very next day, the hostile takeover of her career began. Chloe returned from a walk to find an email with a subject line that turned her blood to ice. Re-curatorial contract. The gallery, her professional sanctuary for a decade, was terminating her position. 48 hours to collect her things. No reason was given, no severance was mentioned. The gallery's largest private donor was a venture capital firm called Pacific Crest Ventures. Chloe didn't need to look up their board of directors to know who was a silent partner. She sank onto the hotel bed, reading the email again and again until the words swam together. 6 months pregnant, with just over $1,000 in her personal account and her career in ashes. The next morning, a call came from an art scout she worked with, her key source for new talent. The call was from her business manager, Mark, his voice thick with an apology he was clearly being forced to deliver. "Chloe, I am so sorry. Our most celebrated artist just backed out of their exclusive representation contract. They're citing a desire to explore NFTs and other digital platforms. Your entire agency is being dissolved." Chloe felt as if the air had been punched from her lungs. "My agency? We just signed 3 new artists. Mark had no more answers to give. I'm truly sorry." She ended the call in a daze, a sickening knot tightening in her stomach. Acting on a dark intuition, she opened the tech news site that Julian read religiously. A news story was featured on the homepage announcing a $300 million investment fund for art tech ventures. The rising star chosen to lead their first major acquisition was a woman named Simone Shaw. The fund, established by Julian Thorne's firm, had been finalized 2 days before her most important artist had walked. Her life's work dismantled, 5 months pregnant. In less than 48 hours, Julian and his mistress had methodically demolished the world she had built for herself. But the assault wasn't finished. That evening, a key card slid into the lock of her hotel room door. She thought it was housekeeping, but it was Julian Thorne, holding a ridiculously expensive bottle of tequila and wearing a look of rehearsed regret. Julian, the man she'd shared a life with for 6 years, the man she had called late one night, her voice trembling with joy to tell him they were going to have a baby. The man who had looked at her across their minimalist kitchen island, his eyes empty and cold, and said, "That wasn't on the product roadmap, Chloe. That introduces an unacceptable level of operational drag." He moved into the guest suite that same week. No more late-night talks, no more casual affection. He missed the first ultrasound, citing a critical seed round meeting, leaving her to clutch the sterile paper on the exam table alone as the technician showed her the first render of their child's fluttering heartbeat on the screen. And there he was, smelling of money and lies, wearing that smooth, rehearsed smile. Clara, he started, walking into the living room. I heard what happened with the firm, with your project. I'm just gutted for you. What do you want, David? I made a mistake, a terrible one. The pressure from the new tower project, the baby, it was a lapse, a complete failure of judgment. But I've had time to think, and I want to be here. For you. For our child. Clara studied his face, really picking it apart, and saw the careful gears of his deception turning. That tiny pause before he said a lapse, while his mind scanned for the most forgivable word. He had no clue about her panic, or that she was staring down the barrel of financial ruin. His only fear was losing control of the story. David, she whispered, her voice thin and brittle. You said a child wasn't in the 5-year plan. You missed every single doctor's appointment, every one. You made me feel like a guest in our own home. And now you appear with a reservation at per se because you're worried about your reputation. Clara, that's not fair. The door is right there. He reached for her, his hands, the ones that had sketched their future on a cocktail napkin, now felt like the bars of a cage. She flinched back like she'd touched a live wire. He started to protest, but she slammed the heavy oak door, shot the deadbolt, and sagged against it, listening to the sound of his expensive loafers fade down the marble hallway. Only then did she sink to the cold floor. By 3 a.m, Clara was huddled on her bathroom floor, clutching a hand towel, her body racked with sobs so deep they felt like they were ripping her apart. She had sidelined her own architectural career to help build his real estate empire. The man who was supposed to be the father of her child was a systematic liar. Her life, once a perfectly designed blueprint, was now a demolition site. More than $1 million of their liquid assets were tied up in real estate trusts that required his signature. She pressed a hand to her stomach, her voice a shredded whisper. I don't know how we're going to get through this. The baby kicked back, a hard, defiant jab against her palm, as if to say, I am here, we will fight. Simone's retaliation was immediate. Less than a week later, a process server handed her a thick legal envelope. They were suing her for leaking confidential bid information and tortious interference, having hired Arthur Vance, a New York legal shark known for destroying careers. Clara's own family lawyer quit in a voicemail that lasted less than 30 seconds. The lawsuit was based on 3 stunning lies. First, that Clara, consumed by professional jealousy, had accessed David's private company servers. Second, that she had deliberately leaked the specs of a confidential development deal to a rival firm. And third, the most poisonous accusation, that she had fabricated emotional distress from her pregnancy to demand a larger share of their marital assets. The preliminary hearing was before Judge Peterson, 58 years old, with 2 decades on the bench. She was famous for her photographic memory and her utter contempt for legal theatrics. She once sanctioned a celebrity lawyer $100,000 for citing a financier's social media post as a legal argument. She was precisely the kind of judge David should have dreaded. The gallery was full, not with press, but with the giants of the New York City real estate world. It was the juiciest scandal to hit the industry in years, and everyone was there to witness the implosion. Clara sat with her new lawyer, a woman her friend had insisted upon, wearing a simple navy dress that was professional, while accommodating her growing belly. Her hands were folded on the table, hiding the tremor that made her want to run. Simone was across the courtroom in a stark white power suit, her expression a perfect mask of betrayed innocence. Vance sat beside her, radiating a calm, predatory energy, a man who knew you destroy a person with 1,000 small cuts, not one big one. He presented his case with chilling precision, portraying Clara as an unstable and bitter spouse who, threatened by her husband's synergy with his brilliant young partner, decided to burn his empire to the ground. He mentioned her paused career, her limited professional circle, her outdated design certifications. He made it all sound terrifyingly believable, which was the most horrifying part. Then he called his first witness. Clara heard the name, but her brain couldn't process it. The plaintiff calls Mark Calloway. A wave of ice surged through her veins. Mark walked to the witness stand in a suit that cost more than Clara's first car. He was sworn in. He sat, and he pointedly refused to look at Clara. Vance's questions were like surgical strikes. Mr. Calloway, how long have you known Clara? About 10 years. We worked together at our first architectural firm. In that time, did she ever speak about her expectations regarding Mr. Sterling's potential wealth? All the time. It was an obsession. She constantly talked about how she was entitled to a massive piece of any future success. She called it her sweat equity. Clara felt the air leave the room, her mouth falling open in shock. Did she ever describe a plan to protect her financial interests? She said she was just biding her time. The plan was to secure her claim before his company went public. She called a potential IPO her getaway fund. Every word was a knife twist. Clara had never, not once, spoken to Mark about money that way. She had shared her worries, her fears about their combined financial risk. Mark knew that. He had been a friend, an ally. He had asked about the single, frayed photograph of her late father on her desk, and she had told him that having more than one was still too painful to see. Now, under oath, he was twisting every real, vulnerable moment they had shared into a weapon to destroy her. Vance was moving in for the kill. Mr. Calloway, in your opinion, was Mrs. Sterling's pregnancy used as leverage in financial discussions? It was a brilliant, cruel play. She saw it all now. Simone had sold David a new blueprint. A story of a true power couple he could build with a partner who was his equal. The idea must have been intoxicating. The private viewing at the Guggenheim was buzzing with the city's elite. But for Clara, the noise had become a high-pitched whine. She could see the entire conspiracy in her mind, the secret alliance between her husband David and his junior partner Simone. Coded messages on a secure app, quiet agreements made in the glass-walled conference room of his downtown office. Her deepest hopes for their new family, for their baby, had been just another variable for him to analyze with another woman. She wanted to smash her champagne flute against a sculpture, to climb on a table and scream that David Sterling was a con artist and a coward. She wanted to shout that the only calculation in her pregnancy was the fierce, animal love she already felt for the child inside her. But her friend Chloe's hand found her arm, a steady pressure that said, asterisk not here, not now, asterisk. The curator called David to the podium to say a few words about his firm's donation. Clara made it to the minimalist restroom just as the first sob tore out of her. She gripped the cold marble vanity, shoving her fist in her mouth to muffle the sound. Her body shook, and the baby gave a sudden hard kick, as if it sensed its mother's pain and wanted to fight back. Chloe found her there. She didn't offer placating words. She just slid down to the tiled floor beside her, her own designer gown puddling around her, a silent, solid presence. She waited until Clara's ragged breaths began to even out. He's a complete fraud, Chloe said, her voice a low growl. And anyone in that room who isn't blinded by his latest zoning variants can see it. He knows all my weak spots, Chloe, Clara rasped. Every insecurity I ever told him. He knows the old Clara, Chloe corrected, turning to face her. The one who drafted his blueprints instead of building her own firm. It's time for him to meet the new one. When they returned to the main rotunda, David was holding court, surrounded by investors. He was magnetic, the center of his own universe. Chloe, a marketing director with the instincts of a shark, watched him with narrowed eyes, already planning a countermove. Clara's lawyer, a legal titan named Isabella Rossi, whom Chloe had on speed dial, started the next morning. Isabella, Clara began, her voice shaky. What do you really know about my husband's finances? Isabella's office had a stunning view of Central Park. Publicly, I know his property portfolio is valued at over $90 million. I know he's the wunderkind of downtown development. I know his reputation is pristine. What I also know is that men like David Sterling don't build skylines without burying a few partners. Over the next few weeks, Isabella and a team of forensic accountants began their own excavation. Did Ethan ever show you the beta for his new smart home system? Miss Sterling asked. Constantly, Chloe replied. For the 6 months before we got pregnant, it was his obsession. Our digital legacy, he called it. He was completely consumed. Miss Sterling leaned closer. What exactly did he say? Chloe closed her eyes. The memory now a bitter pill. He said his greatest terror was creating a world-changing AI only for its purpose to be diluted. He claimed he was restructuring his digital assets, setting up encrypted servers, and building a private network to protect our family. I believed it was for us, for our baby. Miss Sterling's expression was unreadable. Oh, he was certainly protecting a legacy. It just wasn't the one you shared. She brought a flawless, color-coded data map onto the conference screen. For the past 2 years, Ethan Vance has been meticulously architecting a second life and diverting capital to fund it using your shared holdings. He hired boutique coders, he consulted with crypto laundering experts, and he maintained a perfectly hidden set of digital ledgers. Miss Sterling's voice was crisp and final in the sterile, white-walled meeting room. Ethan's lead counsel, a man named Croft, whose face seemed perpetually pinched, gave a short, dismissive laugh. We've had no opportunity to review this so-called data. Miss Sterling offered him a smile devoid of any warmth. You had 24 months to compile it, Mr. Croft. I'm certain we can spare 60 minutes to analyze it now. The enormous screen glowed, displaying a devastating timeline. 24 months of communications on a hidden network between Ethan and Isabella, detailing not only their relationship, but their strategic plan for a new life. A comprehensive business proposal for a rival AI startup with Isabella as the CEO, financed through a web of anonymous crypto wallets. Blueprints for a sprawling, ultra-modern estate in Napa Valley on a piece of land Chloe knew Ethan had claimed was environmentally protected just 8 months ago. Recovered voice memos from a deep-dive data retrieval in which Ethan spoke to Isabella about their empire and our true vision. The room went silent, the only sound the faint hum of the server racks. It was the absolute stillness of a universe collapsing. Then came the money trail. $92 million, systematically funneled from Ethan's personal venture capital funds into a maze of untraceable blockchain accounts. The accounts all fed a parent company registered under Isabella Rossi's name. There were transactions for custom server farms, retainer fees for patent attorneys, and recruitment bonuses for top-tier engineers. Ethan's head of research and development, a man named Alistair Finch, had authorized every single transfer. He had helped Ethan erect a shadow company, rubber-stamping fraudulent hardware invoices and manipulating project budgets to mask the flow of capital. The chief scientist of Ethereal Dynamics had been Ethan's co-conspirator for almost 2 years. Croft jumped from his chair, his face mottling with crimson. "This is a complete fabrication. It's digital slander." Miss Sterling's voice was as sharp and cold as silicon. "It's been authenticated by 2 of the most respected cybersecurity firms in the world, Mr. Croft. Their sworn declarations are included. It was also quite compelling to the Federal Trade Commission, which has launched a formal investigation." Ethan, sitting next to his lawyer, turned the color of ash. He looked at Chloe, his face a caricature of bewildered betrayal with no hint of remorse. Then Miss Sterling slid a tablet across the glass table. It showed a hyper-realistic AI rendering of a family. Chloe's own voice, from a captured smart home recording months prior, played softly from a speaker. "Ethan is building a new digital ecosystem for us for after the baby comes. He says it's about a secure future, better for our family." Then a different voice, a woman's, brittle and confident, from a recovered audio file read aloud by the lawyer. He admitted he's over her. "The baby was a genetic obligation. He said I'm his intellectual equal. I'll make sure that when this is over, Chloe is left with nothing but an algorithm. She was his seed funding, but I am the unicorn." A suffocating silence filled the space. Chloe sat perfectly still, a single tear tracing a silent line down her cheek, her hands instinctively cradling her belly. "Ethan," she said, her voice eerily composed, "I must apologize. Truly, I'm so sorry that my vision wasn't disruptive enough for you. I should have been more of a shark. I should have demanded a larger market share. Please accept my sincere regrets. And please, I am begging you not to let Isabella corrupt the future that belongs to my child." The lawyer paused the audio. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension. Ethan bolted to his feet. "Those are simulations, conceptual models. You're manipulating the data." Miss Sterling met his furious gaze without flinching. "The models were pulled from your private server, time-stamped August 10th of last year. They've been verified by 3 digital forensic analysts. And, Mr. Vance, We have the complete blockchain ledger for the shell company you used to purchase the $5.2 million property in Napa. Would you prefer I display the wallet-to-wallet transfers? Ethan's attorney didn't wait for him to answer. He grabbed his client's arm and whispered urgently in his ear. An hour later, the preliminary terms were agreed upon. Ethan Vance would relinquish all claims to their shared investment portfolio and create an unbreakable seven-figure trust for the child. Chloe would receive a settlement that gave her controlling shares in his private technology incubator. Chloe let her eyelids fall shut. There was no victory, no relief, just the steady, quiet cadence of her own breathing, a feeling she hadn't recognized in years. Just breathing. She had 60 days of silence. 60 days that felt like learning to walk again after being completely dismantled. She listed the sprawling, cold penthouse overlooking San Francisco Bay, a home filled with vast, echoing spaces and Ethan's severe, minimalist design. She could no longer live inside a machine. She found a charming Victorian townhouse on a tree-lined street in Pacific Heights, a house with a secret garden, and rooms that felt warm enough to hold a human soul. Jenna became her shield. She would arrive every morning with tea and a laptop, and they'd sit in Chloe's sun-drenched library while Jenna managed the public relations campaign, fielding calls from tech journalists and carefully crafting the narrative of a poised woman reclaiming her life. Ethereal Dynamics wasn't just a company, it was a Silicon Valley legend, a tech empire with its tendrils deep in the world of venture capital. Chloe, however, wanted nothing to do with it. Her own legacy would be built from scratch. Your husband didn't just build an AI, her friend Jenna said one morning. He built an altar to his own narcissism. It's time for you to design your own reality. Chloe's first meeting for her new foundation was terrifying. It took place in a small, borrowed office with only 3 others, herself, Jenna, and a venture capitalist with a profoundly doubtful expression. She could taste their uncertainty, the unspoken question of whether the tech mogul's soft-spoken ex-wife had the nerve to survive. She faced their doubt directly. "I don't know the first thing about venture capital," she admitted, her voice even and strong. "But I know art. I've spent 15 years in a world where a piece's value is measured by its humanity. You learn to spot what is built to endure. So this is my mission. I am going to listen, I am going to learn, and I am going to fund the creators who are telling a story I believe in. I give you my word. I will not invest a single cent in a project whose code I don't understand with my entire heart." The room was still for a moment. Then Jenna, sitting next to her, started to clap, a slow, deliberate beat of solidarity. Chloe's first major grant was a bid to fund an interactive art installation at a struggling community center in the Mission, a beloved local hub that a tech firm had been trying to buy out. She made the call to the elderly director of the center herself, a woman who began to cry softly on the phone. "Our art program's funding was just cut. We thought we were going to lose a part of our soul." Chloe said simply, "Let's reboot it." Jenna called her that night. "So how does it feel to be the new moral compass of Silicon Valley?" "Terrifying. I made a sweet old woman in the Mission cry because I told her we could save her neighborhood's art program." "You see," Jenna said, "you're already a better founder than Ethan. He only makes his competitors cry." "This is a significant upgrade." Chloe let out a genuine, deep laugh that felt both alien and wonderful, like feeling sunlight for the first time. She had her 32-week ultrasound with Jenna holding her hand. As the doctor moved the probe over her stomach, a perfect, tiny profile appeared on the monitor. A boy? Her son? His fingers, his toes, and a strong, steady heartbeat that echoed in the quiet room, the sound of a new world that was entirely and only hers. Jenna held the 3D scan up to the light. "He already has your determined chin. And look at that little clenched fist. That's my godson, coming into the world ready to write his first line of ethical code." Chloe slipped the picture into her purse, placing it next to a faded photograph of her parents, 2 public school teachers standing proudly in front of the small home they built with their own hands. They were a dynasty of builders. Her grandfather, who laid the foundations, her mother, who weathered the recessions, and now Chloe, who was just starting to sketch her own vision onto the Manhattan skyline. The society columns were gushing, with one piece titled, "The Architect Who Gave a Titan His Soul." Reading it in the comfort of her bed, scooping gelato straight from the pint, Chloe felt a glimmer of something she hadn't allowed herself in years: real, unguarded hope. It was a dangerous feeling. Her new reality didn't crash in. It arrived with a subtle ping from her laptop on a Thursday afternoon, barely a week after the glowing article. Chloe was in Ethan's gleaming office overlooking Central Park, searching for a specific set of ergonomic chair specs he'd promised for the baby's nursery. As she sorted through a stack of old project files, her fingers grazed a slim, encrypted hard drive she'd never seen before. Ethan had never once mentioned it. This was a red flag. A corporate raider, a man named Marcus Vance, had been attempting to poach Ethan's top executives for months. He'd been quietly setting the stage for a hostile takeover of Ethan's boutique investment firm. Gripped by the cold fear of a man whose empire was on the verge of collapse, Ethan knew any deep dive into his financials would spell his end. He'd paid a high-end psychiatrist on Park Avenue to create a fabricated medical history suggesting Chloe's father, the legendary developer who had provided Ethan's seed money, had been suffering from cognitive decline in his final years. He coerced two senior partners at the firm, men whose entire careers were built on her father's mentorship, to back his play to seize control of her family's real estate trust. He had also been feeding a steady stream of calculated lies to a powerful business journalist, planting seeds of doubt about Chloe's own judgment. But the most venomous part of the scheme was its co-conspirator. While reviewing the service elevator security logs for their building, looking for a missing furniture delivery, Chloe noticed Ethan's key card had been used at 2 in the morning, followed seconds later by the key card belonging to Isabella, the seductive new analyst he'd been mentoring. She found the corresponding audio file, their hushed tones, a cold and precise discussion about how to portray her as overwhelmed and unfit to manage her father's portfolio, echoed from the small speaker. The hit piece appeared on a major financial news site just an hour later. Parenthood and Portfolios. Is the heiress to the Sterling Group becoming a liability? The article was a masterpiece of insinuation, focusing on implication rather than fact. It painted a picture of an isolated woman prone to emotional swings and overwhelmed by her pregnancy. The profile framed her as a person drowning in hormones and grief, utterly incapable of steering a billion-dollar real estate empire. Chloe's phone buzzed. It was Isabella. She answered, too stunned to think. "My love." Isabella's voice was a slick performance of concern, honed over years of networking events and charming investors. "I just saw that awful story. I feel physically ill for you. A woman on her own, about to be a mother, trying to manage a legacy of that magnitude. It's simply too much for one person. Your father would have wanted what was most secure for the company." Chloe ended the call, a cold fury causing her to tremble. Isabella called back immediately. Chloe let it ring, but the damage was done. The emergency board meeting was an ambush. Ethan made his case with the practiced solemnity of a funeral director, citing her emotional unpredictability, the pressures of her late-stage pregnancy, and her supposed disconnection from the current market. He presented the coup as a profound act of selfless protection. "We are not seeking to remove Chloe," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "We are merely proposing a period of respite to safeguard the portfolio's stability during this difficult transition." The vote was 7-3 against her. Two junior analysts she'd hired right out of college escorted her from the boardroom. She was standing on the pavement of Wall Street, 8 months pregnant, holding a small cardboard box of her personal effects. A small sterling silver compass her father had given her fell from the box, its chain snapping as it hit the concrete. She stared at the broken keepsake on the ground, the legacy it symbolized now just as fractured. Teslas and town cars whispered past, the city's hum a loud, indifferent drone. Her phone vibrated. A text from a blocked number. "Check your personal email." It was a formal offer from Ethan's lawyer. Isabella would be appointed as the interim head of the Sterling Group. Chloe would be given a monthly allowance of $100,000 and the deed to a penthouse in Tribeca. In exchange, she would relinquish all voting rights in the trust and sign a suffocating non-disclosure agreement, $100,000 a month. It was a joke. It was the monthly maintenance fee on a single one of their buildings. It was the dirt wiped off the boots of an empire her family had forged. At the bottom of the email in a tiny font, this offer will expire in 48 hours. Ethan was giving her 2 days to sign away her life's work. That night, Chloe sat in her friend's guest room in Brooklyn, the view of the Manhattan skyline feeling like a cruel taunt. It was all gone. The company, her office, the life she had envisioned for her child. Her phone rang. The screen illuminated with Ethan's name. She should have smashed it. But at 2 in the morning, 8 months pregnant, sleeping on an air mattress with her world in ashes, you don't always do the smart thing. Chloe. His voice was weak, strained, a pathetic echo of the titan of industry she thought she had married. I know what Isabella did. I know her entire plan. Chloe, I am so sorry. She promised me a massive infusion of capital from her overseas investors, a $500,000 bonus, and a seat on the board of a London firm. I was desperate. I was an idiot. I want to fix it. I will go to the board. I will tell them every last thing. Chloe squeezed her eyes shut. She wanted to believe him. Every raw, wounded fiber of her being screamed to believe that someone, anyone, was on her side. Meet me, Ethan pleaded. That little French cafe on the Upper East Side where we celebrated our first deal. Tomorrow at noon. She said yes. It was a devastating mistake. When Chloe arrived at the cafe the next day, the city's most relentless business reporters were already there, at least 10 of them with cameras, and several live streaming on their phones. Ethan was standing by the entrance, his expression a carefully rehearsed performance of agony. The moment he saw her, she knew. He had sold her out. Again. The headlines that afternoon were merciless. Sterling heiress in public confrontation amidst corporate power struggle, a desperate plea, or a sign of instability. Within hours, Ethan's legal team had filed an emergency motion. The encrypted files, they claimed, were irrefutable evidence that Clara and Julian were engaged in a hostile takeover, a calculated move to seize control of the company before the quarterly investor call. Clara sat in her sister's quiet apartment that evening. Her sister was on a late shift at the hospital. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the faint clang of a distant cable car. She traced the hairline crack on the screen of her old phone, its surface covered in a web of fractures. You're my entire universe. It was the phrase Julian always used after closing another round of funding for his tech firm. Our entire universe, Clara would correct him gently, her hand resting on the curve of her stomach. But his universe had felt galaxies away recently, leaving her in the sterile silence of their glass-walled penthouse overlooking the bay. And then, the baby would move, a sharp, determined jab, a tiny foot pressing against her lung with a force that felt like a secret promise. It's just us, the movement seemed to communicate. It's just us, Mom, and we're a team. Julian's video message arrived at 11 that night, his face illuminated by a computer screen. He was excitedly showing her a demo of his new personal AI, but as he angled his phone, she saw the reflection on the server rack behind him. A private dashboard was open, belonging to Anya. The project title was Jackson Hole. The status update read, "The chalet is confirmed, can't wait to launch," and finally cut the legacy code. Last night was a perfect beta test. He moved the phone, but the words had already seared themselves into Clara's memory. She felt the air rush from her lungs. The baby moved again, not a promise this time, but a call to arms. When she woke the next morning, the fog of betrayal had hardened into something sharp, cold, and precise. A strategy. "Show me everything," she commanded their home's smart interface. She accessed the shared network for the company's financials. Julian wasn't having an affair, he was executing a merger. She didn't need proof anymore. She needed a counteroffer. The first piece of the puzzle was the one he'd sold her on. The digital detox retreat he supposedly needed before the launch. That was his cover. An alibi for this. For a 12-night reservation at a private lodge in Amangani, for 2 seats on a private jet booked with flexible return dates, she pulled up the manifest. The second seat wasn't for his co-founder. It was for Anya. Clara stared at the screen, a heavy, cold certainty settling deep in her bones. The trip had a single agenda: to celebrate the acquisition of her family's initial seed money, funneled into a new venture and paid for by the very company it was supposed to build? It was his ego that destroyed him, ultimately. That was his critical bug. If the affair had been a simple human error buried in guilt, the data might have stayed encrypted. But Julian's betrayal had an architecture. Exorbitant expenses routed through a ghost developer account, a secure cloud partition for his new project, a detailed roadmap for his exit. He logged every stage of the plan. He had literally written the source code for his own ruin. The tea went cold in Chloe's hand. She hadn't realized she was still holding the cup. "The Napa property?" she murmured. Chloe, for the first time in months, felt a jolt of adrenaline that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. The look on his face when he'd mentioned a surprise real estate investment had been one of pure, smug achievement. But it wasn't for their growing family. She found the partition on their secure home server. It contained every blueprint he had commissioned over the past year. Encrypted emails, offshore wire confirmations, a deed for a vineyard estate in St. Helena. It was undeniable proof in Julian's own meticulous data logs that he had been cultivating Anya and her venture capital firm since 2023 using their joint tech portfolio as his personal slush fund. "He was building," Chloe whispered, the words catching in her throat. "He was building his new life with my inheritance, with our child's future." He had engineered a perfect life, one that could only be decrypted with a key he himself had created, his obsessive, arrogant need to document every success. Chloe pressed her palms against the cool metal of his minimalist standing desk. Julian had designed his betrayal so that every step he took toward his new future created an indelible data trail. Every five-star meal charged to a shell company, every investor trip to Singapore logged as a business expense, every transfer to Anya's holding company, it all became another entry in the ledger of his deceit. He had been unknowingly compiling the evidence for his own prosecution for years. Olivia picked up the custom-built data slate she'd discovered hidden beneath a floorboard in his home office. Its screen lit up with his favorite professional quote from a renowned programmer. "The code you write is the world you create." He wanted me to be a feature in his world, she thought. A bitter, sharp anger tightening in her chest. Olivia set the slate down with a crisp tap. "He assumed I would just compile without errors. It's easy to look perfect when your life is built on clean, elegant code. He never imagined I'd find the courage to delete his entire repository when my own world was crashing." And she would. Every fiber of her being vibrated with that knowledge. Olivia stood, her own determined face reflected in the dark screen of the office monitor. How much time did she have before their scheduled trip? It was tomorrow. They had a private jet to a tech summit in Zurich scheduled for 9 p.m. Does Isabel know that I know? Impossible. Olivia walked to the floor-to-ceiling window that offered a stunning view of the Boston harbor, inhaling deeply. "Cancel the Zurich flight and all associated transport for tomorrow," she said to the home's AI. As the system chirped its confirmation, a slow, predatory smile touched her lips. "And book a table at Menton. Tomorrow night, 8 o'clock, a table for 3. What's the occasion? I'm about to launch a hostile takeover of my husband's life. The sprawling seaport condo Marcus had coded from the ground up was meant to be their magnum opus. Tonight, the city lights sparkled below like a field of fallen stars. Olivia, 8 months pregnant, was supposed to be finalizing the designs for their smart nursery. Instead, she was looking at the secret venture Marcus kept buried on a private server. He named it the Nightingale Initiative. Her breath caught in her throat as she accessed the next directory. Inside were not plans for a new charity app, but transaction records from a Boston jeweler for a bespoke sapphire necklace. A river of perfect cornflower blue gems, elegant and timeless. And it was certainly not the one he'd given her for their anniversary. The jeweler's notes were excruciatingly specific, mentioning an inside joke about a sailing trip in Newport, an event Marcus claimed he attended with venture capitalists. A wave of vertigo washed over her as she scrolled down. It was more than just jewelry. It was a perfectly compiled log of a 3-year deception, invoices for a long-term lease on a penthouse at the Mandarin Oriental, held by a shell corporation. First-class flight records for 2 to Monaco, to Tokyo, to Davos, all during times he was supposedly at international coding symposiums. And then, the files. Folders of schematics and renderings of his affair with Isabel Thorne, the brilliant, ruthless CEO of a rival AI firm. Isabel sipping wine on a yacht, the Newport Bridge visible behind them. Isabel wearing his MIT sweatshirt on the half-finished deck of the Martha's Vineyard home he was building for her. Every file was another security breach in their life, revealing not a simple bug, but a carefully engineered alternate reality. He wasn't just cheating. He was building a competing empire with another woman, financed by the company their marriage had created. The $150 million valuation of his startup now seemed insignificant compared to the cost of 3 stolen years. When Liam walked in, at nearly 2 a.m., he was electric, smelling of wood smoke and a gardenia perfume she never wore. He kissed her forehead, completely unaware, buzzing about a new Michelin star he was sure his restaurant would get. Ava was waiting for him in their stark white kitchen, a single, unfamiliar menu illuminated on the marble island. His triumphant smile faltered. The denial came out instantly, a practiced line. "It's not what you're thinking, Ava. You're pregnant. Your hormones are running wild." But she just silently slid her phone across the island, showing him a wire transfer. His voice fell to a hush. "The one to that vineyard in Napa? The week I was supposedly sick with the flu, while I was carrying your son? Or the one that financed a secret passion project that cost more than our first apartment?" His face went pale, a portrait of shock. You had my finances investigated?" It was an accusation, stripped of any shame. And in that cold, clinical question, she knew their partnership was over. "This wasn't a side project, Liam," she said, her voice a low, steady flame that hid the shaking in her hands. "This was an entirely new menu. You built a whole new restaurant on our shared foundation." The celebrity chef finally cracked, his famous composure crumbling into a desperate scramble. He claimed the affair was meaningless, just a creative experiment that he loved her and their brand. But his words were like an oversalted dish, promises from a recipe that was already ruined. She watched the man who could command a kitchen of 30 people come completely apart. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood, a hand resting on her growing belly, and said, "I want your knives packed. Tonight." The finality in her voice was sharper than any chef's blade. The heavy, silent door of their Upper East Side penthouse clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing in the sudden, cavernous quiet. There were no thrown plates, no public spectacle, just the swift, quiet gutting of a brand exposed by a single secret menu. As the doorman called a taxi for him, Liam paused. He glanced up at the limestone building, a monument to their shared success. He knew he wasn't just losing his home, he was losing the one recipe that had ever truly worked. He had built a culinary empire, but he had traded its soul for a fleeting taste of something new. Ava had the locks changed before sunrise. His 41 texts remained unread. The extravagant bouquet of rare orchids was rejected at the front desk. Her best friend Sarah showed up with an overnight bag and a look that could curdle milk. In a drawer Liam had forgotten, Sarah found an early draft of the secret menu. On the back, in his mistress Chloe's looping script, it read, "He said every great dish needs an inspiration. I guess some palates are just meant to be refined." Ava looked at it, her face a perfect mask. "Love isn't a recipe, Sarah," she said, tearing the menu into 2 clean halves. "You can't just cross out an ingredient and rewrite the whole dish." The proof was all over an anonymous food industry gossip forum. Ava scrolled through years of posts, a history of whispered sightings and blurry photos, 3 years of lies, artfully plated and served to the world. She absorbed every detail, forcing herself to see the full extent of the betrayal. It was a painful palate cleanser, stripping away the glossy image of the man she thought she married. She wept for the future that was now just a reservation for one, crying until all she felt was a cold, empty calm. She saved the entire thread to a secure file, labeling it Final Course. Her mother's portrait, a vibrant painting of a bustling market, seemed to watch from the wall, a silent reminder of a resilience she was just starting to find. It was during a call with her divorce lawyer, while calmly listing Liam's offshore accounts, that the first contraction gripped her. "Sarah," she said, her voice tight but unwavering, "I think it's time for the main event." Sarah navigated Park Avenue like a getaway driver, her Tesla a silent missile against a chorus of angry horns. "I saw this on a TV show," Sarah shouted, swerving around a double-parked car. "I think you're supposed to do that weird breathing thing, which honestly looks exhausting." Ava focused on a fixed point. "Just get me to Lenox Hill, Sarah." Her father, a famous retired food critic, was already on the phone with the head of maternity, his authoritative voice ensuring the best doctor was scrubbed in and ready. "Sarah, that light was orange at best," he barked over the car's speaker system. "It was more of a polite suggestion," she yelled back. Noah James Peterson was born at 11:03 p.m., weighing a healthy 7 pounds 9 ounces. He had Ava's dark, soulful eyes and a quiet, observant nature that reminded her of her own father. As Ava held him, the chaos of the past few weeks finally dissolved. The lights of the Manhattan skyline beyond the hospital window seemed softer, more welcoming. Her father stood by the door, his eyes glistening with pride, watching the first course of a new legacy being served. Sarah was asleep in the chair, her phone slipping from her grasp. On the bedside table, next to a glass of water, was a small, worn, leather-bound notebook that had been her mother's. Inscribed on the first page were her words, "The best ingredients are integrity and truth." Ava looked down at her son, so perfect and new, completely unaware of the restaurant empire held in his name or the bitter feud that had preceded his birth. "Your father was a master of presentation," she whispered, stroking his cheek, "but he never understood the heart of a recipe." "And your mother," she smiled, a real, warm smile that finally reached her eyes, "was a food critic who fell for a very clever fake." Noah let out a small, contented sigh. "But you," she whispered, kissing his forehead, "you, my love, are the masterpiece." She smiled not for the lawyers, or the coming settlement, or the culinary empire she would now methodically dismantle and rebuild with her own values. A quiet, determined smile played on her lips, a secret she shared only with the new life in her arms. It was the feeling of creating a legacy that was entirely hers, something no one could ever adulterate, because the review was coming, just like her mother had always said it would. For the first time in years, Ava felt like the executive chef of her own life. Outside the hospital, the New York skyline cut a sharp, dramatic silhouette against the dawn. Their power couple brand was a sham. The recipe for their perfect life had been a lie, and somewhere, in whatever gleaming kitchen arrogant men go to hide, Liam was about to be served his just desserts. And his wife was finally claiming her own table. This is a story about the slow poison of lies and the clarifying power of a bitter truth. It's about those who cook with soul versus those who cook for the applause of strangers. If you've ever been made to feel like a lesser ingredient, been taken for granted, or felt like a line cook in your own life, then this story is for you. If you're ready, let's begin. This story will make you think differently about those perfectly plated relationships you see on your social media. And if this journey speaks to you, I have a quick request. Please subscribe, drop a comment to let me know where you're tuning in from, and share this with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength today. Because these kinds of stories aren't just entertainment. They're a reminder of the fire we all have in our own kitchens. This entire story was intentionally conceived, researched, and written by our team to bring you compelling narratives with lessons that stick. Every single word was chosen with purpose because we believe that stories with substance are more important now than they have ever been. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for being such a vital part of our community.